the first place in the pattern where you will be picking up and knitting is along the shoulder seams from the back piece of the sweater, picking up along each shoulder to begin the fronts. The pattern has you work the right front first, which I've done here to demonstrate what it should look like after you have picked up and knit along the shoulder. So, as you can see, the goal in picking up and knitting here is to make that shoulder seam practically invisible, which means that you want to have continuous columns of knit stitches running across where the seam is. You can see the seam from the back. Turn it around a little bit, you can see that bump, right? But on the front of the work, it should be almost invisible. I do want to point out that as you're doing this, you should be aware that on both the back and the front, along the armhole, there is a selvage with one column of knits and then one column of purls. This is important for picking up the armhole later. As you are picking up and knitting along the shoulder, be sure that this edge, you pick up and knit one stitch in each, the knit column and the purl column. It's kind of hard to see here. In each, the knit column and the purl column along the armhole edge, so that you have an unbroken line for the armhole here later, right? Okay, so since I've finished the right front, I'm going to start the left front here. Unlike the right front, you're going to start the left front from the middle, which means that you need to count the number of stitches specified in the pattern from the armhole edge. I've already done that, and I've added a stitch marker here. Before we begin, I'm going to show you how to identify where you're going to be picking up stitches. If you look at your cast on edge here from the top, you can see that there are these little V's, right? Little V stitches here from the cast on edge. You can also, if you look at it from the side here, you can see that just under those V's, there are holes in the pattern. You might have to pull yours apart to really be able to see that. When you're picking up and knitting along the cast on edge, you're going to stick your needle in right under the two threads here that make that V, like this. Okay, so using whatever needle size is your main needles for the pattern, based on your gauge, you're going to start by sticking the needle in here underneath that V and wrapping your yarn, pulling through to knit it, just like that. Gonna do it again for the next stitch here. One more time. And so on down the shoulder seam until you have picked them all up. Oop. I'm not usually an English knitter. I'm now going to demonstrate continental. So, if you're a continental knitter, put your yarn in your left hand. Find that spot under the V, right here. Pick up the yarn. And pull it through. And continue on down the line until you have picked up all of the stitches for your shoulder seam. And that's it. to pick up stitches for the armhole, we're going to be working in this column of purl stitches along the edge. You can see here, this is the column of knit stitches, the column of purl stitches, and then into the body of the sweater. So pull your fabric apart as needed to identify that column of purl stitches, and count down from the top of the shoulder seam, which you can identify by that bump, right? Count from the top of the shoulder seam to the right the specified number of rows in the pattern. The easiest way to spot these is to pull the fabric apart and just count the holes, because that's where you're going to be sticking your needle. There's a hole, another hole, right? Just like that. So I have already counted and I've put a stitch marker in the first hole that I'm going to be starting with. So I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to stick it into that hole, wrap the yarn around, and pull it through. I'm going to go ahead and remove that stitch marker now. Okay, so I've picked up my first stitch and I'm going to continue along that column of purl stitches up toward the shoulder. So there's one, another one. I'll demonstrate English style now. Stick my needle in like this, wrap, pull it through. One more time. If you pull the side seam apart, you should be able to see that you have one picked up and knit stitch in each of those holes. To pick up and knit stitches for the mid armhole, you're going to do the same thing, but unlike the upper armhole, you're going to skip every other hole, because at this point you will be picking up one stitch for every 2 rows. So I've finished picking up and knitting for the upper armhole. So now I'm going to skip this next hole here and work into the one right after it. Going to skip the next hole here, work into the one right after it. Skip this next hole, work into this one. I'll demonstrate English style now. Going to skip the next hole, work into the one right after it. Skip that next hole, work into the one right after it. To pick up and knit stitches for the lower armhole, you will be using the same technique that you used for the shoulder seams from the back when you were picking up for the fronts. Now, because you have worked cable cast-ons for these stitches along the armhole, it can be a little bit tricky to spot the right place to pick up your stitches if you're looking in the same way that you did with the shoulders, where you were looking for those V's on the top of the cast-on. I recommend instead looking for the places between the columns of knit stitches so you are sure you're picking one up for each row, for each column of stitches. So I'm going to start here and stick my needle in here, my first stitch. The next stitch will be the next row over, right here. the next one here. Now, because the cable cast on is a little bit bumpy from the different rows, you might find that you have to just make do in some places as you go, and that's okay, right? So see, there's a pretty sharp incline here because this was where I turned after I worked a cable cast on, and then I did this cable cast on the next row, right? So this is where I'm looking to make sure that I get in the next column, which is going to be right here. There it is. And here. Just like that. If you feel that as you are picking up stitches, there are some holes in your work, you can pick up an extra one to fill in those holes, making sure that you still have the right number overall as you're going. The other thing that you can do is you can pull on this little bit of fabric behind the work to be sure that it's nice and secure. And if in the end you still have any little gaps, you can use a darning needle and yarn to close them up. It may take a couple attempts to get the stitch count exactly right for all the picked up stitches around the armhole, and that's just fine. Another thing that you can do if you are really struggling to get the stitch count right is before you begin picking up, you can count the available rows and cast on stitches and put stitch markers in each of the places so you know exactly how many stitches you're going to be picking up in each segment. Once you have them all picked up, you have your markers in place, you are ready to begin working the sleeve cap. To pick up stitches around the neck, you're going to begin by picking up from the center of the back in the same way that you picked up stitches for the shoulder seams and the underarms of the armhole. When you get to the shoulder seam and you're moving on to the front, you're going to be picking up from rows. So I'm going to show you how to do that here. The pattern says to pick up 2 stitches, pick up and knit 2 stitches over every 3 rows. The thing that you want to be careful to do as you pick up along the side here, you want to be certain that you are always picking up in the same column of stitches along the front, or your edge won't look neat. So I'm going to begin here, pull the fabric apart as needed. Going to stick my needle in here. If you notice, each of these knit stitches has a V shape. You're going to stick your needle into the middle of that V and knit it. And then the next one, because that's 2 rows, 2 stitches for the first 2 rows, skip the third, and then the next one, 1, 2, skip the third, 1, 2, and so on down the line. Again, being very careful to make sure that all of your stitches are in the same column along the front. When you get to the bottom of the neck, the lowest part of the scoop neck, you're going to pick those stitches up the same way that you did for the underarm of the armhole. And that's it.